Okay, folks, we are going to get started here. Thank you for coming out tonight. I was just chatting with some of my colleagues as to how almost every night of the week has become a hard night for a lecture because students have classes. And they're in these other classes and seminars, and Tuesday is particularly bad. So I'm glad you are not all in another class. Thank you for being here. And thank you for this kickoff to you all for coming, and to Paul on journalism and the threats that journalists face. I'm hoping that you've seen the posters around campus or in the Central Maine Morning Sentinel about the ways in which journalists sacrifice for freedom of expression and freedom of thought. So we have a number of events, and this is number one. You are most welcome. Thursday night, we'll be doing a screening. Yes, it is on YouTube already. Yes, it is on Frontline. But you can meet the producer who interviewed Khashoggi. All right? You can meet some of the people who actually featured in the film will be with us on Friday. So Thursday night, Railroad Square. Friday, 4 o'clock, the all-college convocation in the chapel on Lovejoy. And Friday at noon for lunch, and 1 o'clock for a panel with the editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, who was the editor who had the terrible and tragic duty to preside over the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, and the editor of the Annapolis Gazette, who was the editor who had to deal with his staff when a gunman came in and mowed his staff down. So if you feel this closing in terms of freedom, of the voice of journalists, to guarantee that freedom, I just hope you can make a commitment to come to at least one of these things and stand up with journalists. And so tonight, Paul, and launching this, maybe needs no introduction, but let me share a few factoids. The students I've had in class know I like some fun facts. So Paul began his educational journey at Antioch College, studied for his master's at Harvard, and received his PhD from MIT. Maybe there are some of you in this room that know that his course on science, race, and gender may be in the lead for the most sought-after way to satisfy both an N and U distribution. Could be, right?
Something new.
Something new, NU. In addition to Colby, he holds or has held appointments as professor at the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute, Moscow and Tomsk State University in Russia. Paul studies big science, big dams, nuclear sites, physics. Best I can tell, but I don't really know, he pretty much understands them. His book on flying, floating, and stationary reactors, food irradiation programs, and fusion convinced him that there is no such thing as peaceful nuclear technology. You can save that question for the Q&A following. He's currently working on an NSF-funded project on the history of the conquest of the Russian North during Soviet power. He seems to like cold places. Not sure, because it's hard to count, the number of times he's been to the Soviet Union or Russia, or the number of marathons he's run. There was a Facebook post where Professor Josephson says he lost track of the number of times he's run the Boston Marathon, but he also noted he wears a Colby shirt because it gets him the most shout-outs. I thought you told me, but I don't have a good memory for these kinds of things, that you're targeting to run 200 marathons?
That's the goal. Wow.
Yeah. So you better be sure you can count them, right? You better be sure you can count them. And I want to know on Facebook, apropos of our conversation at dinner, is Facebook big tech or small tech? But maybe that's another talk. Studying Soviet science, he's a close follower of Putin, not a fan, a follower. We'll hear more about this in a minute. So for now, please join me with gratitude for Professor Josephson taking time from his busy schedule to talk about the very difficult environment for journalists in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night in the rain and dark. After assuming his presidency in 2000, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent, focused his energy on controlling state and media, and he quickly insisted that all the major TV channels, still the most powerful medium for communicating information in Russia, submit to the Kremlin. By 2006, virtually all major Russian media were either directly or indirectly under control of the state. Today, 3 major Russian TV channels, either directly owned by the state or operating as state enterprises, provide most of the information to Russian citizens. Russians get 90% of their information from TV. I stopped myself watching TV a few years ago. I use internet sources, so this is very strange to me. They are Channel 1, the all-Russian state television and radio broadcasting company, NTV, and there's some others as well. There's Russia Today or Россия Сегодня. There's TASS, a layover from the communist era. But none of them are really free and open as they were for a brief period, and nor entirely is the Russian internet, with the major Russian company, the equivalent of Facebook, called VKontakte, also now in control of the Kremlin. Already early in the Russian presidency, the government used criminal investigations to force out 2 of the biggest media magnates, Boris Berezovsky, who owned Channel 1, and Vladimir Guzinsky, who owned NTV, not MTV, but N. To control the domestic and foreign media, or at least to make sure there's a Russian take on the foreign media, under the Putin government there have been a series of restrictive laws passed. They include the fact that enabled the Russian government to force out owners of various franchises or media organizations. There are fines and other penalties for people who misspeak on such controversial topics as terrorism and drug abuse. Independent outlets have been threatened into self-censorship in Russia today. One has the sense already that the media would be a major battleground for control of the Russian people, since already in the Putin years, in the Yeltsin years. Now, I wanted you just to have a quick look at this table, which indicates the number of Russian journalists killed 1993 to 2009. And it appears to be an undercount, judging from other independent sources. But the numbers are vast, and there are many, even if fewer in the Putin years. The 90s were a time of the Wild West in Russia. And I'll come back to that at the very end of my talk when I mention the careers and short lives of 2 very important individuals in the Russian, in history of Russian journalism. But this should frame my talk as I speak about other aspects of the Russian media and journalism today that involves state control and various indirect and direct pressures in order to limit and shape the kinds of information available to a wide number of people. most of you don't know, but in 1993 there was a constitutional crisis in Russia where Boris Yeltsin tried to force the parliament to change the constitution to permit him to rule with greater power. And a battle broke out, literally a pitched battle in Moscow with the Russian troops loyal to Yeltsin firing on the parliament, the White House here, but also with protesters taking over or trying to take over, with a number of deaths, City Hall and the Ostankina TV tower. The battle for these things led to hundreds being killed and wounded, including 62 dead to take the TV tower. And to me, that left no doubt already in the 1990s, when I had already become a regular visitor to Russia, the former Soviet Union, having first gone in 1984, that information control is something that the state would not forget. Let there be no doubt, Russian media control, the Russian government control the media, does so in subtle ways, in legal and not so subtle ways. The not so subtle ways, I would argue, include, for example, the great glacial pace of investigations, prosecution, and the resolution of criminal cases against the murderers of journalists that leave few people satisfied who are concerned about the role of the press in modern society. Many of the criminals who have killed these journalists remain at large, and the question who orchestrated or ordered the killings also remains unsolved. For so many people, this has raised the question, rather than solving the question, whether the government and its security minions are actually behind some of the murders and violence. Even if they're not behind the murder and violence against journalists, many people will think that the government must support this. Now, it's tempting to get a sense of why the media are so important to the Russian government today. And in Putin's case, it's clear that his hands are all over the situation. The president's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, says that Putin is where he wants to be, at the center of the media machine with all the information at his command. This is not surprising given his career as a KGB agent. He also insists that there is the appropriate image of Russia at home and abroad. He receives daily summaries from his press office of the world press, and he also reads many of the sources himself in German and in English. His English is not fluent, but his German is, since he was a KGB officer there. He views the summaries in his car, on the airplane, in his helicopter, and on the run. And unlike Trump, who does not read and watches only TV, he apparently takes in other sources of media information as well. Members of the Putin administration seek to control television and to decide what the foreign and domestic coverage will be, what is to be covered and what will not be covered. And they do so, once again, by using some methods I'll talk about in a few moments of subtle and not so subtle control, of indirect and direct control. The editors-in-chief of all the major media attend regular strategy meetings with President Putin. There's a major Western news clipping service that plays a role here in ensuring that the president knows what's going on and that he can have his hand on shaping what Russian people see, and also an effort to manufacture Russia's image abroad as the true defender of morality in the world, and also to challenge the US narrative. There are people who tend to the images of the president. It's also clear that war with Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea have pushed the government to strive for even greater control of the media. When Putin explained in his annual end of the year 2014 address to the nation the religious, historical, and strategic reasons for taking Crimea, and the need to protect Russia and Russian territories from fascists in Ukraine, which is all part of his narrative, he also decried the moral bankruptcy in the West. And so the taking of Crimea back into Russian hands was a way to color this picture of the takeover. Of course, it's also clear that Russia has done its best to obfuscate the truth about the shooting down of the MH17 July 24, 2014 flight originating in Amsterdam on its way to Malaysia, with all 298 people on board killed, shot down by Russian Buk surface-to-air missiles. According to Alexei Venediktov, the head of Echo Moskwy, the Echo of Moscow, one of the few remaining independent outlets in Russia, the Ukraine war solidified President Putin's view of the media. He said, "It's not an institution of civil society, media are, it's propaganda. The Russian broadcasters today, internationally, these are all instruments for reaching a goal inside the country and abroad." There is, unfortunately, a long history of crimes of violence against and murder against journalists with impunity. As I noted before, at least 21 journalists have been killed in Russia since Putin became president, but I found much more information about a larger number of individuals. And I mentioned also that crimes against journalists remain generally unsolved, fostering a climate of impunity. But what's important to Putin is creating a well-orchestrated and highly visible persona in order to shape the news events. One of the ways in which he does this is through annual press conferences, and you can follow these annual press conferences at kremlin.ru in English or in Russian. These annual press conferences are broadcast live by the major state-controlled journalistic media, and they're also on the radio. They're highly publicized, they're closely controlled, they're attended by hundreds of reporters who really insist upon showing up. The seances offer little news, no major policy pronouncements, but they're rhetorical in their give and take, and they reveal an omniscient and powerful leader. The annual conferences, however, do sometimes reveal subtle changes in what's going on in the president's mind. I do not intend a content analysis here, but I'm not a government major, I'm only a historian. But at a 2018 press conference, according to many observers, the word stability lost its central space in his speeches. He uttered the word stability or stable only 4 times in his 2018 press conference. So it's clear that the president is more worried, according to that kind of analysis, about the state of the world. For many years, the notion of stability had been a synonym for Putin's Russia, and rising public disregard for the president's message may have something to do with that. Now, there are also, that's the annual press conferences, and there are also press meetings live over TV with Russian citizens who ask him questions on TV and he answers them. This can go on for a series of hours, although the people who call in are usually selected beforehand. It's Q&A that's controlled, but here too there's been an indication that President Putin feels less secure in his control of the media than he did, say, in 2000, 2004, 2008. For example, this year he admitted that the economy was struggling while the ordinary Russia had to eke out an existence to make ends meet, and that there were falling living standards. A call from a doctor in Murmansk where I once saw the sun rise on January 9th after a 3-week delay. I was the only one who ran to the top of the fjord to see it. I thought all the Russians would be up there to see the sun, but I was the only one, foreigner. A call from a doctor from Murmansk region promised a pledge from Putin to get someone to look into his problem of getting medical supplies. And in fact, within minutes of that comment, the region's acting government ordered an inspection of the problem at hand. Beyond violence, what has been the president's strategy, the government's strategy for dealing with the media? Putin has a two-pronged media strategy. First, by clamping down on all the communications, primarily TV, as mentioned, by which way the population gets its information, and also increasingly newspapers, radio stations, and more the internet. State-aligned news outlets are flooded with the Kremlin's messages. Independent outlets have been pushed to be silent or to self-censor. Friends of mine who have owned media outlets have been forced to sell to the Kremlin or to businesses of oligarchs associated with the Kremlin. So all of this has given state control of the media beyond the murdering and beating up of journalists, which certainly is effective. The government uses other ways, however, to silence an independent press. It uses opaque laws, not only here, but in finance as well, as you all know. So-called anti-terrorist legislation, tax investigations, sending authorities into businesses to rip apart their papers, look at their books, and shut them down for violations of tax laws, and so on. And arbitrariness. Here are a few exceptions, examples. TV Dozhd, or Rain. This is one of the few remaining channels that presents a non-government perspective on many issues. Indeed, it reports on corruption, and it did so in 2009, 2010, 2011 and 12. It reported on the heavy Moscow street protests and the war in Ukraine. In January of 2014, stepping over the line, it polled viewers on whether the Soviet Union should have allowed the Nazis to capture Leningrad in order to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who died from starvation during the blockade. Okay, this is a great event in Soviet and post-Soviet memory. The war is extremely important. The blockade of Leningrad, where a third of the population perished, is a heroic event. But it's been prohibited to offer alternative thoughts on the official narrative of World War II. In December of 2014, the channel's landlord broke their lease. This is one of the greatest ways that Russian leadership has of controlling organizations with which it disagrees. It sends in municipal inspectors to claim they're violating housing codes or safety codes, and soon the business is out on the street. Another story concerns Echo Moskvy. I put these slides in the wrong order, forgive me. I did this literally on the fly, and I've been up since 3:30, so if anything is coherent tonight, I'm grateful. And if it's not, I'll be grateful if you say it is. Echo of Moscow under Venediktov, I mentioned before, which got in trouble for negatively reporting on the death of the elder son of one of Putin's staff members. Talking about Putin's family is not allowed. Talking about staff members is not allowed. And as a result, the station's main shareholder, Gazprom, one of the largest capitalized companies in the world, had the reporter in question fired. And here's the third example, Russia Today. Many of you have probably seen this. I practice not looking at Russia Today. It's to explain the country and its mission to the rest of the world. Its coverage seems focused on the US as a threat. It sees fracking in the US as evil and a threat, because fracking, of course, gives US more energy independence and greater ability to compete with Russia. It weaponizes news. It spreads a story that Russians are uniquely a beacon for proper family values. That means anti-gay views, Russian orthodoxy, and so on. And they also put on stories that harken back to the Soviet past, which is, of course, glorious. There's the Stalin era of the Gulag camps. They don't talk so much about that. They talk about the T-34 tank of World War II fame. And they even produced a film about the newly completed Crimean Bridge that enabled Russia to bring supplies and tourists from Krasnodar across the Kerch Straits into Putin's here. Was that a bug?
Yes.
RT produced a film called Crimean Bridge, which, as you might imagine, is as shitty as it sounds. And it's the unlikely love story during the building of the bridge between a young couple who will be united from different sides, Crimea and Russia, when it's complete. And one of them is a Tatar who says at one point in the film about his fellow Tatars, well, you know, they were sent away. That means it had to be. What he was referring to is the fact that in 1944, Stalin ordered 208,000 Tatars to leave the peninsula, half of whom died en route to Central Asia. PEN America's January 2016 report, Discourse on Danger, Attacks on Free Expression in Putin's Russia, traces the way in which various strands of laws have converged into a tightening net on the media, and they do this in a number of different ways. Wars to combat terrorism, wars to combat extremism, laws to combat terrorism, to combat extremism, and against incitement of hatred. Let me give you some examples of that. Anti-terrorism legislation. There was a siege at the Nordost Dubrovka Theater in 2002 when several hundred people died in ending a terrorist act by Chechen terrorists who'd taken over the theater that was filled with 750 or 760 people, and the authorities eventually put in a, what is it called, a fentanyl derivative into the air system, ventilation system, to put everyone to sleep. But a lot of people died from that, and the authorities have never explained how many people died from putting an opioid into the system to put everyone asleep. Then they entered and shot all of the terrorists, most of whom were already, how should we say, out cold. And the media reported on this event a little bit too openly. So they passed a law that makes it illegal to spread fake news about terrorist events. Yes, you're right in drawing that connection. Then there's another law against battling extremist attitudes and ethnic hatred. To give you an example of this, the way this worked out, a group in Sakha in central Siberia is trying to fight a new hydroelectric power station whose dam and reservoir will inundate the lands of the Evenki people. And these anti-dam people on this website, Plotina.net, which is great, it's a .net instead of a .ru, and therefore it's registered in Michigan. They can't shut it down. But it means no dams, niet, as in net. And these people wrote that the Evenki way of life, the hydroelectric power company brought a suit against them for spreading extremist views, denying the Evenki the rights to have a new glorious future of hydroelectricity. Fortunately, in that case, the authorities did not prosecute further. There's also extremism legislation which has been used against the media. Any action that might be interpreted as incitement to hatred or hostility or humiliation of human dignity. But this has been used to shut down diversity of voices. And finally, the government has turned also recently to the internet. Now, I don't know what to say here because, as we were talking about over dinner, the internet is it's confusing to talk about whether it permits a proliferation of information or whether it enables government control. It's truly decentralized, it's unruly, it makes the study of the internet and different political systems quite challenging. For some people, it's a paragon of democracy. For others, it's infuriating. In social media, it can be an alternative space for civic dialogue and public participation. In countries with more closed media, however, web services can provide a number of ways of preventing the circumvention of official channels. And in non-democratic regimes like Russia, China, some in the Middle East, it has developed, the governments have developed, with the assistance of their own software people, sophisticated and intrusive internet filtering. And that's the case of the former relatively free and open Russian Facebook, which is called Vkontakte. And as he was leaving a press conference on his way out of Russia, Pavel Durov, who's a very well-known individual here, gave him his impression of what he thought of government efforts to take his station away from him. He's now living abroad. And he said, "I have no plans to go back," and gave this gesture. There's also the use of arbitrariness. And Russia has a great tradition of arbitrariness. If I can do 200 marathons, I might write another book on arbitrariness and focus on Russia. But these are just a series of examples. I don't want to keep you here late tonight on the ways in which arbitrariness can play a role in enabling state power to control journalism. But there are also, let's return to the fact, often violent efforts to close the media down, as recently as this summer when there were demonstrations in Moscow against Moscow City Council candidates. No alternative candidates were allowed by the state. So the opponents of this tried to get citizens to vote for any other candidate. That was successful. They went out on the street, they were beaten, they were arrested, and many journalists were beaten and arrested, including with broken bones. There's a new Russian organization called Roskomnadzor, the Russian Inspectorate for Communication, which is like its predecessor, the Soviet Glavlit. It works in mysterious ways, and it can raise its ugly head to censor journalistic activity. Masha Gessen, many of you know, a writer and pen trustee, noted the selectivity and at times arbitrariness of Roskomnadzor's enforcement protocols create significant uncertainty for writers, publishers, broadcasters, websites, and other media producers, often resulting in self-censorship as a way to avoid uncertain laws and arbitrary enforcement. And I have a great deal of examples of this arbitrariness, this violence, and so on. But I'd like to move towards concluding, because I've kept you too long already, by telling you about violence against journalists, in specific two instances of murder of journalists, that reveal the government's apparent unwillingness to solve these crimes against leading Russian citizens. And the first is Paul Klebnikov, who was the founding editor of Forbes Russia, who was working late one night, July 9th, 2004, and as he left his Moscow office at 10 p.m., at least one gunman fired 9 times from a passing car. The wounded Klebnikov described his assailant as with black hair and black clothes, but didn't know the person's identity. Klebnikov is a Russian of American of Russian descent, had launched the Forbes Russian journal just months before in April 2004, believing that reforms were propelling the country towards greater transparency. And he began to write about things like crony capitalism and the oligarchs. And he was a veteran investigative journalist. And he immediately put Russia's financial and business elite in the limelight. And he pursued other very risky topics, for example, the 1995 murder of television journalist Vyacheslav Listyev and the gangster capitalism of the 1990s. And so it may have been all of those reasons that someone wanted him dead, who we will never know. The authorities gave the impression of a high-level investigation. They arrested some people, but jury trials that were carried out did little to protect the safety of the jurists, and eventually there were acquittals. A new trial was ordered, and one of the defendants has disappeared. The other defendant, who was eventually brought to trial, lives in Russia openly, and the verdict itself remains open. And the second journalist I want to mention is Anna Politkovskaya, who worked for the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta, a courageous and superb journalist whose reporting on human rights, war in Chechnya, and corruption, published in Russian, in English, in many languages abroad, certainly brought the wrath of a large number of individuals toward her, certainly the Kremlin, certainly the Chechen government. She was shot dead in her Moscow apartment building after returning from a grocery store on the afternoon of October 7, 2006. A man shot her 4 times with a 9mm pistol. News of the shooting spread around the world within hours. She was a sharp critic of the way that Russia carried out the war in Chechnya. She'd written about torture, official corruption, human rights abuses. Putin spoke about the killing only 3 days later, rather than speaking up immediately and condemning it. And he denied complicity of his government in any way in the murder. I can't believe that anybody currently in office would come up with the idea of organizing such a crime, he said. Her eventual murderers, at least alleged, were finally convicted. The New York Times reported on June 10, 2014, almost 8 years after the gruesome murder of Anna Politkovskaya, one of Russia's most respected investigative journalists, Moscow's highest criminal court finally sentenced 5 men to prison, 2 of them to life in part of a conspiracy to assassinate Politkovskaya. There are sometimes signs of hope. There's the Listyev Prize, named after the journalist who was killed in 1995, Vladimir Listyev, who had been one of the most popular journalists. I won't show anything of this clip right now. He was returning from a broadcast show in the evening from his show Час Пик, which means rush hour, and he was shot dead in the stairs of his apartment building. The killing caused enormous public outcry. In an unprecedented move, most of the major TV stations the next day had for their broadcast only a sign that said, Vladislav Listyev ubit. Listyev has been murdered. So Parfyonov gave a talk, winning the first and last, as far as I can tell, Listyev Prize, in which he condemned fellow journalists, including himself in Russia, 2014, did I say, for their dependence on the authorities. And journalists are not journalists at all, but bureaucrats. He said, media stories, and with them all of my life, now fall into two immutable categories: those that can be broadcast on television and those that cannot. I speak with bitterness, having worked for Russian television full-time or freelance for 25 years, and I have no one to blame but myself, and I cannot blame my colleagues. So he did this in a public ceremony, and the Russian media did not report on it. For my concluding remarks, let me just return briefly to Politkovskaya. Here's what Penn proclaimed recently. On October 7, 2006, the Penn community lost a tireless champion, a voice for the voiceless, and a fearless colleague. Anna Politkovskaya was found dead, shot to death in her apartment, a block in central Moscow. Since her killing, Penn has been campaigning for justice for Anna Politkovskaya. At the Penn International Conference in 2016, Penn President Jennifer Clement went on talking about why many journalists might ask why many people might ask why a journalist simply using her words as a trade would be such a threat to anyone. Anna's words, she said, are still important and necessary in calling for justice from Putin's government. And after she died, Politkovskaya, they found among Politkovskaya's papers in her apartment an essay entitled, "So What Am I Guilty?" And she wrote, just briefly, in Russia, the people of the presidential administration that effectively runs the country are on side, on the right side, or not offside, on side. Anyone not on side is an enemy. The vast majority of those working in the media support this dualism. Their reports detail how good on-side people are and deplore the despicable nature of enemies. What happens to journalists who don't want to perform in the big top? They become pariahs. They're offside. The state closes its eyes to the fact that the majority of the people live in abject poverty, that the real standard of living outside of Moscow is much lower than claimed, that the corruption within Putin's power pyramid, and so on and so forth. Today, a journalist who is not on side is an outcast. And she concludes by saying, of what am I guilty? I have merely reported what I witnessed, nothing but the truth. I must sadly finally conclude with a warning about the crude similarities among President Trump and Putin. Both share a desire for power and control. Both rail against fake news while promoting their own kind. Both display a public hatred of media, or at least deep disrespect. Both use the media to distract from real crises. And when Trump encourages violence against journalism and others and decries fake news, he takes a page out of Putin's book. He believes in Putin's book. And in fact, as you see here, the two have smirked about it together. So this was a different relationship, I think we can say. Let's remember all of the journalists, the courageous journalists, who have struggled and continue to struggle to tell the truth in Russia today. Let's remember those who have been killed in Russia since Putin became president, and those who have been killed since the 1990s Let's thank those courageous journalists who understand that they are true patriots, that they want a stronger and more free Russia, and free of corruption too. And let's hope that no one more will be murdered in the name of state power. After all, of what are they guilty?
It's a very powerful way for us to think about of what am I guilty, right? And how we can stand on the side of journalism, how we might do that in the next couple of days at the Lovejoy. But before we get to those moments, what questions do you have tonight? Please. And if you would just introduce yourselves briefly to the group, that's appreciated. Behind you there, Adam.
Hi, my name is Victor Schmidt, and I am a colleague of Paul's in the history department. I'm not exactly sure how to phrase this question, but it's an idea that's been kicking around in my head for since the presentation, since the start of your presentation, with these highly orchestrated news conference, very carefully curated official news. What use would these be to I guess, foreign scholars, foreign news reporters looking at them? Are we kind of sliding back towards Kremlinology here, or is there something a little bit more substantial that we can glean besides, who's sitting in what seat and who's looking well and things like that?
I think it's much more than who's sitting next to whom. I think there really is something to the context and the content of what he says. So I don't want to belittle content analysis as a tool for understanding the president's thinking, or as a measure of the administration's sense of what's going on in Russia today and how to deal with it. Because they're obviously aware of the pressures of the declining cost for a barrel of oil and the effect of that on Russian economic growth. They've asked the public to retire at 2 or 3 years later so they can, save the government budget. They're requiring sacrifices of the public that they didn't during the boom years 2005 to 2013, 2014. The sanctions are important, but there are other economic factors on the that have an impact on the growing discontent among the Russian people. So I think we can gauge that. If President Putin wants to pretend that he has a democracy, then he needs to engage the public. And the orchestrations are becoming more challenging for him, I think, as he tires of the difficulties in presenting a good message today.
Thanks. My name's Sarah Duncan, and also a colleague of Paul's. I had a question, and I was struck by another feature of your talk. The thing that I was struck by was the letter or the article that you read at the end, where she distinguishes between journalists who criticize the state and the existence of many journalists who don't. And I found that very interesting, the existence of a cohort of journalists who work in service of the state. And I was just wondering whether journalism under Putin's government has become a route to power, to some kind of to the goodies that the state can provide. I was wondering, why would one become a journalist in Putin's Russia when it is clearly such a dangerous profession? That was the first thing. The second thing was, I was thinking, of course, a lot about South Africa and apartheid, where the media was as strictly controlled as well. And South Africans, we know, listened to and watched state-controlled media, fully knowing that they were only getting not so much half the story, but a quarter of the story, but were sophisticated enough often to be able to read between the lines. And I was just wondering to what extent that's also true for Russia, whether all of this propaganda is as effective as the Russian government hopes it is, because certainly their efforts to influence international audiences have been quite effective.
second one first. In the 1980s, through the University of Illinois, but with a large number of other university partners, the National Council for Soviet and East European Research funded an interview project. Thousands of Russian emigres abroad, Soviet emigres abroad, were interviewed by the participants, German teams, Israeli teams, US teams, where most of the diaspora of Soviet citizens live. And of course, they had to control for the makeup of those citizens, many of them being Jewish, former refuseniks, and so on. But what they learned was something really interesting that I think probably holds to this day, which is that people who watch these kind of reports on TV accept the reality outside of their own country because they can't see it with their own eyes. So what they heard about the spoiled and rotten West, emigres abroad tended to believe, but what they heard about the quality of life within the country was something that they could judge objectively themselves. And they began eventually not to tolerate the persistent lies, especially, it's not when things are not getting better, but when things are getting worse. And I think that's what the Kremlin is going to have to struggle with today, especially because all Russians, babushki, students, everyone has a cell phone or an iPhone, has access to the internet. There are a wide number of ways to get information, to understand the quality of life within the country, and it's not improving as it had been promised. The other question, the first one was, briefly again?
Why be a journalist when it's so dangerous?
That I can't tell, although for a long time, through the 2000s, if you were a 15, 16, 17-year-old thinking about university or going into it, and in Russia you go into a specific department, you don't go to a liberal arts college and pick a few years later. Business and law were very important, but journalism was also pretty damn attractive to many young people. And I think it still is, although I don't know the numbers of positions in all the journalism schools in the country. So there's something attractive, I think, for Americans, for French, for Russian young people about being journalists. You can do cutting-edge work, you can ask difficult questions, and you can do important things. And so there's still ways of addressing certain problems that are not offside. And I think many people like to do that. And I think others have talked themselves as Politkovskaya and Parfenov talked about, who have come to grips with the very difficult challenge they face of being journalists in an authoritarian regime by making sacrifices with which they may not be happy. At the end of his talk, live talk, which is available here if you want to write that down, or you can get in touch with me and I'll send you the link, which is probably the easier way to do it. And then I can translate it for you while it's going on, or Liana or Luke can do that for you if you call them up. But in any event, he criticizes himself and other journalists for becoming tools of the state and not sticking true to the to what Politkovskaya asks us to do as journalists, which is not to think that you're guilty of anything if you just report the truth.
Liam's coming the other side.
Thank you. Luke Parker, I teach Russian here. So Paul, you ended your talk with the discussion of the link between the media and politics. In Russia today, probably the most prominent opposition politician is Alexei Navalny, who is a prolific user of unofficial media, of kind of social media, internet, YouTube. I mean, he's on there, you know, more than Trump. And he's very good at it. And he's very charismatic. You know, he constantly is kind of retweeting and reporting on things that the official media don't comment on. Do you see any possibilities for political change or the growth of political opposition through the use of unofficial media that is not as tightly regulated by the state?
I don't know. I don't know. Being very honest about it. One, as a bleeding heart liberal, one would like to think. But I often end up in this place where I wonder what will happen when Putin either retires or dies, because I think that he's created a system where succession is really a difficult question. And there may be another smutnaya vremya, a time of troubles until the Russian political system sorts itself out. That's the danger of systems like this, which are so wedded to one charismatic leader, that there's often a dark and difficult period afterwards when those kinds of skilled people like Navalny, whose politics aren't really very progressive after all, will have much greater vitality and impact on the political system. But I think the authorities are very powerful right now in this regard. I think President Putin is the key, whether he decides in what year is it that his current term is up? 2048? Or no, 24, right? 24?
18 plus 6.
24? Yeah. Good Lord. Okay.
We always have student questions. Someone. Thanks, Tessa.
Hi, my name is Tessa. I'm a senior here. So how would the state try to frame, for example, an embarrassment on the part of the government? I'm thinking of like the doping scandal that came out recently with the Olympic Committee. Would they report on that, or would they try to spin the narrative?
There's been a three-pronged response. I won't call it attack. One has been to ignore it. The second has been to ignore it. And the third, more recently, has been for some of the government officials who are responsible for dealing with the mess and trying to get Russian athletes back into the Olympics. They've been very critical, actually, of the lack of upper-level government support in cleaning up a scandalously filthy athletic system. So I was surprised by that. In particular, most recently to the, I think within a month that the international agencies are going to put another hold on Russian participation in the Japan Olympics, because they've not provided the data that they're supposed to, and the people in the sports enterprise don't want that outcome. It really is so KGB, however, of Russia to have pursued doping as a way to ensure victory of Russian athletes in the Olympics. In the run-up to the 2014 Olympics, there were the University Olympic International Championships in Russia in 2011 and in Kazan. And all the other world teams sent university athletes, and the Russians sent Olympic teams so they could win. So you had the Russian Olympic volleyball team beating university teams in volleyball and winning the most medals, and it was hurrah and pride. So this is important for President Putin. He's been relatively silent about the doping scandal. It's really interesting to go to Kremlin.ru. It's much more rich in its coverage of what's going on in the world and what the Putin administration is doing and thinking than, say, the White House portal is. which I visit every day to write the president, by the way. I've saved my letters. None of them are threatening, but none are supportive either.
Another question?
Hi, I'm Peter Beckerman. I'm from Waterville. I'm a retired attorney. Tell me, have the Russians tried to infiltrate cable TV with their own news outlets? I thought I saw something a few years ago where they had an anchor person in the news.
Right. There's a Russian media outlet called Russia Today, which has a very strong international presence, and they have been on cable. I don't know if you can get it right now.
I can't find it.
Yeah. So I never looked for it, but they're active and busy, and sometimes when I subscribe to a few of the Google services. One of them is Russian News, Daily News, and there are a lot of RT stories which have to be taken with a grain of salt because they're shaped by this woman who's very capable. Well, there's RT. Let's see, where is that? This is Semyonian, who with her husband run RT. She was only, I believe, 24 when she moved to Russia Today. She's seasoned, capable, and presents that glorious image of Russia that President Putin really likes. So this is probably around through the internet, but I'm not sure whether you can get it in a US package right now. You can see it in Europe. When I travel there, I always see it listed.
Paul, I am getting RT pop-ups in the bottom of my screen.
Oh my God.
Right now?
Yeah, pretty much, today. So maybe I need to go to ITS and get my computer cleaned.
That moth that came by my eyes had RT on its wings.
It's really kind of frightening. Is there any last question to wrap up here? Well, if you're feeling what I'm feeling, I'm sufficiently frightened, right, of this space for journalists and getting the stories out in this interconnected world that we live in. So thank you so much for sharing insights from Russia, and I hope to see many of you around. Friday lunch is over in Bob's. 1 o'clock is the presentation from the two editors on how one manages that kind of violence. There's a story this week in The Atlantic on how the community in Pittsburgh is taking different positions, political positions or quietly personal positions, and reconciling their grief. The questions surrounding the Annapolis massacre in the newsroom are so graphic for not having that kind of freedom of the press or the courage for many to stand up and express opinions in their communities. So I hope you join us for that. For the 4 o'clock in the chapel, it's followed by an open cocktail hour in Cotter Union. So if you have family or friends visiting for family homecoming weekend, just think of it as, a toast on Colby to all that journalists have done. So bring them along. Thank you for coming out, and I look forward to seeing you this weekend.